I'm Albert Lanier, and we're live. This is the third and last of the test lives for not the concept of the live show, but for YouTube, period. So, this last one, as per the idea and the concept of the live show, is entitled A Lie of Crime, an analysis of the usual suspects. Are you not familiar with the film The Usual Suspects? Came out in 1995 and was directed by Bryan Singer, who went on to do a number of sort of big budget superhero films, as well as it was written by Christopher McQuarrie, who went on to win an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay for his script for The Usual Suspects. The Usual Suspects also won Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for one of its cast members, Kevin Spacey. And when it comes to the cast, people who were in the cast, Kevin Spacey, of course, who won an Oscar, Benicio del Toro, Gabriel Byrne, Stephen Baldwin, Chaz Palminteri, Kevin Pollak, just to name a few. Dan Hedaya was another one in the film. But that's a sort of brief description of the film. Well, description of what the film did. It was got a good deal of critical reception back in 1995 when it came out, or decent critical reception in 1995 when it came out. And The Usual Suspects is a film that likely has its number of partisans and a number of fans. So the question is, why is this analysis called A Lie of Crime? Right? Well, The Usual Suspects is on the surface about five criminals who end up being involved in a plot in San Pedro Boat Harbor. What happens is that goes awry. Uh, which is at the end of The Usual Suspects. This goes awry, winding up in an explosion with 22 people, gunshots, explosions, with 22 people being killed. And The Usual Suspects has been described by some as a film that has as its sort of main preoccupation the question, who is Keyser Söze? And that's one way to look at the film, right? For those who have not heard of the film, or for those who are aware of the film. But my examination of The Usual Suspects um, deals with it, and the reason why I call it a lie of crime is because fundamentally, when we look at this film, it is fundamentally a film that is a deception. It is basically one large and huge deception that is created by one of its protagonists. Because it's largely, I would say, an ensemble film. Even though Kevin Spacey is one of the major figures, or Kevin Spacey's Verbal Kint character is one of the major figures in it. Um, Kevin Spacey, of course, plays Verbal Kint, one of the five criminals that were involved in this really botched fiasco um, of a criminal operation in San Pedro. Um, Benicio del Toro plays Fenster. Gabriel Burns plays uh, Dean Keaton, ex-cop. Stephen Baldwin is McManus. And of course, Kevin Pollak is Hockney. Now, Hockney, McManus, Fenster, they're all proper criminals, as the British would say. Uh, Byrne is Burns Keaton is an ex-cop who went bad, right? And is supposedly in this film trying to straighten out because he's involved with attorney. His girlfriend is an attorney, criminal defense attorney, actually. And then, of course, there's Kevin Spacey's Verbal Kint, who is like Hockney and Fenster and McManus, a proper criminal, as the British would say. Now, all five of these men find themselves in a lineup, police lineup, because of a, a truck of gun parts that was ripped off, right? Now, just to give you an example, for those of you who aren't familiar with the film, just to give you an example of the film. So these five criminals, McManus, Fenster, Keaton, Kint, and Hotney, find themselves in a police lineup. They're brought in by NYPD because this truckload of gun parts got stolen. And of course, they have to state an infamous phrase, which I will not repeat here, in the lineup. Now, the suspicious thing about the lineup is, as all five men note when they're in holding, isn't it odd that five criminals are going to be on a police lineup? Normally, you would have a person who is a criminal with four other people hired to be in a police lineup, just so that the person doing the identification would be thrown off somewhat, and you could get a proper ID. But they had five actual criminals in the same lineup. Doesn't make sense, right? Until much later on in the film when you find out why they were in the lineup. So what happens in The Usual Suspects is that it's a film that's structured in a way that makes light of flashbacks, right? Because it's set in what would technically be the present, and you're flashing back to the past, right? That's where the police lineup comes in. That's where the criminals talking to each other comes in. That's where the operation, as we eventually see it at San Pedro Boat Harbor, comes in. And The Usual Suspects is set up in this kind of flashback structure, right? Weaving in and out between the quote unquote present and the past, right? Now, again, people have argued in regards to The Usual Suspects. Now, people have all kinds of arguments, right? So, as I mentioned, the predominant question has been, who is Keyser Söze? Now, in the film, Keyser Söze is described by Verbal Kint, who in the present day finds himself at a police station. Verbal is the only one who has survived the botched operation in San Pedro. All the others, all the other criminals, Hockney and Fenster and Keaton and McManus were killed. Ken is the only one who survives. And so he's sitting down with Dave Coulion, who is a federal agent. And he's interrogating him. He's talking to him. So that's the gist of the framing of the film in terms of the structure. Is the present day largely Coulion's talking to Verbal Kint. And we flash back because Kint's talking about the lineup and how he met all the other criminals and how everything transpired. So the film is told largely through the eyes of the Verbal Kint character. And this is important to in looking at my analysis of The Usual Suspects. Because as I mentioned before, The Usual Suspects is what I describe as a lie of crime. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the essentially The Usual Suspects is one gigantic uh, construction of, of deception. The whole film is a total and utter deception. The whole film is a total and utter falsehood from beginning to end. Now, those of you who are watching this, I assume that you've seen the film. Some of you haven't, but those of you who have, I assume you've seen the film. So basically, if you haven't seen the film, probably best not to watch this because I'm going to give away the ending. Because it's important to give away the ending to this film in terms of my analysis. So if you haven't seen it, I advise you to go and see it before you see this. Okay. Now again, my argument is in analyzing this film is that The Usual Suspects is one gigantic deception. It is one immense lie. And the reason that I say this is, and in my examination of it, is The Usual Suspects as a thriller and as a crime thriller with a twist at the end. The reason why it works so well is because it is fundamentally a falsehood. It's basically a story woven out of thin air, or as we find out in the film, from the details that are all around the room, right? And this is a story that is basically constructed by the Verbal Kint character, right? So, at its very core, The Usual Suspects as a film, in terms of its narrative, is a lie. And it's about a character, Verbal Kint, who is fundamentally, throughout the course of this film, lying. Now, why is this important in viewing The Usual Suspects? Because I would argue that this gets at the core of the criminal enterprise, at the core of criminals. Criminals are fundamentally liars. And criminals lie not simply to get out of trouble or simply to better their lot in life if they need to, but because it is a function and a part of who they are. Many, many criminals, professional criminals, if you want to use the term, many of them are liars. And I don't mean just the con men, but I mean thieves and, you know, thieves and burglars and murderers and so forth. A lot of them are liars because lying is the stock and trade of the criminal, of not so much the criminal enterprise of being a criminal. Lying is a part of it. And so when we look at The Usual Suspects, it's fundamentally about this character's ability to turn the tables on the Dave Coulion character. The Dave Coulion character thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. He thinks he knows who Keyser Söze is because that is the preoccupation of the film. Keyser Söze, of course, is this sort of, kingpin underworld boogeyman that we see in the film. The Verbal Kint character describes how this character basically had men come in and threaten his family. And without going into detail, and to quote Verbal Kint, Keyser Söze showed these men just what Will was. And I'll leave it, although I'm talking about the ending, in this film. I won't talk about every little dynamic or element, so I'll leave that for people to look at and figure out, right? So I think for me, in analyzing The Usual Suspect, is understanding the nature of deception, in understanding the nature of lies, and understanding them from the standpoint of crime. That crime and criminal enterprise is partially based on lying, and that lying is a part of the stock and trade of any seasoned professional criminal. And so I think that is key when analyzing, or that is the key to my analysis and the essence of my analysis of this film. What The Usual Suspects is a lie of crime, which seems like an odd phrase, right? A lie of crime, right? But what does Verbal Kint do in this film? He lies. Fundamentally, Verbal Kint, when talking to Agent Dave Coulion, has basically created this, you could call it a criminal big fish story of sorts. He's created this sort of improvised pastiche of deception. And that's the key. I think that's the key in understanding this film. And I think people who saw the film, and especially saw its ending, this may help them with it, because the ending for some people at the time in 1995 and even now may seem like a bit of a cheat, or may seem to come from nowhere, which is due to the skill of the screenwriter Christopher McQuarrie, and I think the director Bryan Singer, who do, I think, an excellent job in basically playing poker, right? In one sense, the Usual Suspects is um, one long poker game, right? Everyone is trying to bluff. And that's why I said that the idea that to understand this film, I think fundamentally you have to look at it as pure BS, as a deliberate deception. Because at the end, you will come to understand that it is. Because when Verbal Kint leaves that station at the end, and when we can see that Verbal Kint, who we've known throughout the movie, is this kind of, you know, disabled, you know, gimpy individual physically, we see him begin to straighten out his hand and straighten out his legs moving. And we realize that this has been essentially a con. The film is essentially a sort of, what, I forget how many minutes it is, hour and a half, 2 hour con. That's essentially what the viewer has been. The viewer has been conned. The viewer has been conned by Verbal Kint. The viewer has been conned by, or should I say, the moviegoer has been conned by Bryan Singer and Christopher McQuarrie. They've been conned. This is why I say that the film is about the essence of what criminals normally do. It's about the essence of some aspects of criminality, namely deception. This is what criminals do. They lie. And they lie not only as a matter of benefiting themselves and getting out of trouble, but often for its own sake. You know, they do it not because they have to, but because they choose to. In this case, the Verbal Kint character isn't doing it for fun. He's doing it because that's essentially what he knows. Right? It's another, you know, as I mentioned before, what's important to understand about The Usual Suspects is it's essentially, whether we realize it or not, it's a battle of wills. It's a battle of wills between Agent Kulian and Verbal Kint. Now, it doesn't seem that way if you watch the film. It seems like Kulian's got all the cards, so to speak, to bring us back to that poker analogy. He's got all the cards that he needs in order to win this hand. But he doesn't. It just seems like he has an upper hand. It just seems like he knows, but he doesn't know. Yeah. So he uh, so he doesn't know. So that's another element to The Usual Suspects, is that battle of wills, which doesn't seem like a battle of wills. It doesn't seem like this kind of contest between these two men. It seems like a typical police interrogation or a law enforcement interrogation, where this agent is trying to sweat this criminal to get what he wants out of him. And what Agent Kulian wants from Verbal is to convince him that Dean Keaton is Keyser Söze, because that's what he believes. Again, you have to look at that character as believing he has all the cards, the deck. He believes he's the smartest guy in the room, but he's not. And at the end of this film, he realizes he's been outwitted by Verbal Kint. He's been conned. And by the end of this film, he realizes there's not much he can do about it. Which is why the ending of The Usual Suspects works so well. Because it's structured in such a way. Because this is often what happens in the real world. People don't realize they're being lied to until it's much too late. This is the essence of the con man. The essence of the con man is you don't know you've been conned until you've lost your money. What is that old cliche? You know, if you don't know who the sucker is in a poker game, then maybe it's you. Right? So that's why the idea, the way I look at this, or the way I analyze this, it is one grand, drawn out deception. It's one huge lie. And that's why the ending's so important. Because much like with con artists, much like with any kind of con game, you have to find out that you have been lied to, that you've been deceived, that you have been taught a lesson. That's very important. And I think that's why some people don't get the ending of The Usual Suspect, or don't like the ending of The Usual Suspect. A lot of people like it, but a number of them don't, because they feel cheated. But that's the point of the film. You are cheated because that's what criminals do. They take your money. And they don't just take your money or your jewels or your other valuables. They take your trust. And once they rob you of that trust, it's a bigger, that's a bigger thing that outweighs all the other elements. You can always get more money. You can always get more jewelry. You can always get more items that have some valuable meaning to you. But you can't always restore trust once it's gone. And that's what's important when we look at a film like The Usual Suspects. That's why the structure of that film, the writing of that film works so well. Because it starts us from a point of curiosity, as I think any crime thriller like this would. And we get more and more engrossed and wrapped up, right? Because the primary question becomes, who is Kaiser Soze, right? But I would argue, again, when we look at this film, what's missing, not necessarily missing from analyses of the film, but what I think should be kept in mind is what happens with Verbal Kint and with Agent Kuyan is a battle of wits. But but it's also, again, a con game. Because Verbal Kint cons Kuyan into thinking that he can manipulate, like he can overpower him, meaning Kuyan can overpower Kint, right? And then we know by the end of the film that the whole Verbal Kint aspect is a lie. Not only is what he told Kuyan a lie, as we find out in the end, right? But the whole, but that whole, but his essence is a lie. The fact who he is Verbal Kint, is a lie. Because if we are to believe the narrative of the film, Verbal Kint is Kaiser Soze. But there are those who doubt that, and that's a whole other discussion. But what's important is, I would argue, that even that question, who is Kaiser Soze, it's deemed the important thread throughout the film for obvious reasons, or what kind of guy this is. I mean, we had a description of who he was. This sort of, mysterious, nightmarish criminal, you know, kingpin figure. But I would argue also that in keeping with the idea of deception and of lying, that Kaiser Soze himself is a lie. That's what I would argue. And that's why I feel like the Kaiser, who is Kaiser Soze, is kind of like a red herring in the film. It's a red herring in my dissection of it. Because what it does is it keeps us focused. It keeps us, moving on. It keeps us intrigued. Right? Again, it's like what I said, big fish story. It's the hook that grabs the fish, right? It keeps us going. The structure of the film is essentially one long, grand deception. It's artifice. It's a constructed falsehood. And that's why that film is so great. It's so not only intriguing, I think, to moviegoers and film goers of all types, but I think why it works. It doesn't work in the way that most people do, because films are not like television. Well, really, really good films are not like television, right? Really, really good films, excellent films, don't play to lowest common denominator. They play to a higher standard. So when we look at this film, that's what The Usual Suspects has done. That's why the construct of this film as this grand deception, as this enormous lie, is important, because it's the way that we have to understand. It's the way you will understand the ending. Because if you don't get that this film is one big lie, I don't mean on the surface, but in all levels, then you won't get the ending of this film, and you won't get this film. You won't understand it, right? The reason why this film works is because it is relentless in its ability to con us. The film is fundamentally not only a lie, as I mentioned in my analysis, a lie of crime, which seems like a contradiction, but it's one large con game. Everybody's getting conned. Agent Kuyan's getting conned. Obviously, Hockney and Fenster and McManus and Keaton got conned. You know, the film is one long con game. And so at the end, you, the audience member, once you see the ending of The Usual Suspects, have been conned, right? But it isn't just a con game, which you can expect. It is also fundamentally about deception, about lying. Because lying, as I mentioned before, is central to the criminal enterprise, to being a criminal. And that, I think, is the essential thrust of this film. That it is a film about lying. It is a film about deception. It is a film about falsehoods, right? Bryan Singer has compared this film, I think, to films like Citizen Kane and Double Indemnity. You know, James, I think, the adaptation of the novel, the crime film was the adaptation of the novel, and Rashomon. Now, Rashomon is an interesting comparison because Rashomon is, of course, a story about a man that was attacked and a woman assaulted, um, based on a Japanese short story, and it was done by Kurosawa as Rashomon. And it's told through different points of view, right? But here, in The Usual Suspects, we see the film told from one point of view, that is verbal hints. But I think where the comparison to Rashomon is apt is the idea of the point of view and the importance of the point of view. And that's another element when it comes to this film is point of view. Verbals is the only point of view in the story. Like I said, all the other criminals, Hockney and Fenster and McManus and Keaton, were killed. In San Pedro, in that botched operation. Verbal was the only survivor. Right away, I think you have to be suspicious of the Verbal Kid character. Right? So at this point, I think there are one or two people in the chat here. Um, I'm a little curious. Someone had said in the chat that they don't have great storytelling anymore, like they did in the 90s. Well, you always hear that argument about films, right? They don't make them like they used to. It's not as good as it used to be. Um, that's a whole other. I never care. You know, I never agree because every era produces films of high caliber. Every era produces films that will stand years afterwards. But every era, every decade, also produces films that won't. I think this is true of anything in the entertainment medium or mediums. There are going to be great pop songs and terrible pop songs. There are going to be great TV shows and horrible TV shows. Okay. So I'm looking now into chat. Yeah, so I'm now engaged with people in chat here. I think someone in the chat was saying they stick to foreign films and art films. Yeah, when I was reviewing films, I used to be a film reviewer. Um, Basically, I was covering film festivals in Hawaii. So I was an online film reviewer, and I would largely watch foreign films, films from Asia, Pacific, as well as some others. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun. But I had to balance that. I only was a reviewer um, around film festival time because I had to balance out because I was a freelance. For those who aren't aware, I was a freelance writer and um, journalist for 22 years. So I had to balance that out with um, my other concerns, with other work. So it was, when the festivals came along, yeah, it was a bit of a dream because I could get away from, say, covering politics, which I did at times. I covered local elections and I covered other stories, other features, and news stories, whatever came along for me as a freelancer, whatever I could get. And so it was always great to cover the festival year in and year out, to cover festivals. So I guess it was a bit of a dream gig, not the dream gig. I mean, if I had been able to go to most of the great festivals like Cannes or Sundance, let me see, Berlin, Venice, you know, Toronto, yeah, that would have been great. But I was mostly a local regional freelancer and local regional reporter, so and I was there. So um, I could go on in terms of discussing more about the critique or the examination, but I do want to do that. But I actually am interested if there are people in the chat whether they have anything to offer or anything to talk about in regards to the usual suspects. And if they do, um, I'll respond to that. What are your thoughts about the usual suspects? If there are anyone in the chat, anyone in the clouds who wants to come to the chat, up to you. I love the way my eyes start out there. YouTube's such a I don't know if people normally write scripts for these lives or these kind of things, but I'm just doing this off the top of my head, so it's all improvised, right? I assume much like Verbal Kid talking to Agent Coolion and the usual suspects, right? Um, well, anyway, I'll continue on with examination. So you haven't seen it yet. I think you should watch it. You definitely should watch it. Now, again, I think why the usual suspects works so well is what I had mentioned before about it not only being a con game for the viewer, where the moviegoer and the viewer is conned, but that you also within the film essentially see that the verbal kid character is conning Agent Kulion. We don't really get that until the end of the film. At the end of the film, we know it's been a con. And if you don't want to acknowledge it, that's fine, but it's a con. And we also know that the film itself is basically, by the end, one long piece of folderol, one enormous, immense deception, one gigantic conglomeration of lies, but an entertaining conglomeration of lies, right? And that's why I think this film is important. I think people look at it from the standpoint of who's Heiser Soze and does this work as a thriller and how does it work as a crime film and all the basic elements that are within it. Um, when you're reviewing a movie, you look at how good was the direction, how effective was the script, how are the performances, Like I said, this is an analysis of the film. This isn't a review of the film. I'm not reviewing it to say, yes, this was good because of this, that, and the other thing. I'm examining the themes and the motifs and perhaps for some symbols in the film, right? And that's important to know. Um, so, as I mentioned before, it's not just a con game for Verbal Kint with for the audience, but also essentially a battle of wits. And I would argue that Verbal is conning Agent Kulian. Of course, we know that by the end of the movie, right? And it's important to see this as a film about the life of crime and about the life of criminals. It doesn't go into detail about these criminals. It doesn't go into their private lives extensively or get us a sense, a very human sense of criminals. It is a thriller. It's a crime thriller, after all, with a twist ending. But my point is that the film tells us in its own, the film tells us through its crime thriller genre, and through its twist ending. I think it tells us a good deal about the criminal world, about being a criminal, and being a criminal is about lying. No, it's not quite like Donnie Brasco. Donnie Brasco is about organized crime. That's a straightforward. That's an undercover informant mob film. The Usual Suspects is a crime thriller uh, with a twist ending, right? So the ending flips everything that you've seen in the film, right? So that's the importance of the ending. So that's why I say that if you look at the ending, Verbal Kint is not who he has pretended to be. And Agent Kulian realizes that he has just been not just conned, but tricked. And what Verbal Kint has basically done is create a magic trick, right? Trick is an important, I think, is an important word to use here, right? There's a line that Verbal Kint says to Agent Kulian. He says, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing us that he doesn't exist." Now, why is that seemingly odd line, slightly philosophical line? Why is that in the script? For those of you who have seen the film, think about that. Why is that line in the script? The greatest trick Devil ever played was convincing people he didn't exist, or convincing us he didn't exist. Why is that there? I would argue it's there because that's essentially what Verbal Kint has done. In The Usual Suspects, he has tried to convince Agent Kulian that he's right in his own way. Kulian believes that Kaiser Soze is Dean Keaton, or that Dean Keaton is Kaiser Soze. And if what we know about Kaiser Soze, or what we are led to believe about Kaiser Soze, as I have noted, uh, is the case at the end of the film, then, and this goes back to what I had mentioned before, right? Um, with Kaiser Soze. That is the so-called preoccupation of the film as analyzed by critics and others, by other critics, right? But my argument is it doesn't matter who Kaiser Soze is, because Kaiser Soze himself, in my view, is an invention anyway. Kaiser Soze is a trick. And I think in the film, the greatest trick is trying to convince the viewer and Agent Kulian and others that Kaiser Soze does exist. Vanna has a, and that's a good point. in the chat. Vanna brought up a good point in the chat. So when it comes to Kaiser Soze and the usual suspects, here's my argument. What Verbal Kint is trying to do is convince Agent Kuyan and the audience and others that that Kaiser Soze does exist, and that is his trick. So it's a film that has a couple of levels, at least a couple of levels, if not more levels, of assessment and perception. The whole film, after all, is an edifice. It's artifice, as I mentioned before, but it's an edifice of artifice. It's a facade. It's a film that deliberately misleads us. Now, does it mislead us because it's a crime thriller with a twist ending in that simple way? No. As I mentioned before, it misleads us because this is what criminals do. They lie. They deceive. They prevaricate. They try to convince people that what they think is true is true. After all, this is the nature of con artists. That's what con artists do. A con artist's job is to get you to believe that they are who they say they are. A con artist, after all, is an actor. I know this sounds hard for some people to believe, but think about it. What does a con artist do? Now, this film isn't about con artistry, so let's get that straight. We're not talking about con artists here, per se. Although you could argue Verbal Kint is a con artist. But it's not about con artistry, per se. It's about a group of criminals. And this supposed criminal mastermind, Kaiser Soze. But my argument is that it is, even though it's not about con artists per se, and it's not a film about con artistry, that the film is a con game, that it is con artistry, right? It's a trick. You could also argue that the film is sort of like a magician, an illusionist, right? In fact, you could say the film is also not just a con game, not just one long deception, but it's also one huge magic trick, right? You could argue that what we have with Verbal Kint when he's being interrogated by Agent Kuyan and Verbal Kint telling his story is a magician using the pretty assistant. After all, in the world of illusion, pretty assistants exist as a means of distraction, as a means of taking your eye off the prize, which is the trick. Right? So in that world, deception is important. Because the whole point of that world, being the world of illusionists, is so that you don't know how it happened. You don't know how the trick. As Roger Ebert said in an essay once, or in a film review once, and this is a phrase I like to use myself. The trick is told when the trick is sold. Right. Yeah, the film, I'm trying to remember, I saw this like, I don't know, what was 20 years ago or what have you, when I saw The Usual Suspect. I had a sense that something was up with Verbal Kint, that he seemed too good to be true. So the ending of that film, I thought, was a great con and a great trick when I first saw it. And yeah, I knew it was a con. I knew it was misleading, which is what thrillers sometimes do. It's not unusual. But the way this film is constructed, that's why I say it's important to look at the essence of lying and the essence of deception, because otherwise this film doesn't work for people if you well, I think it won't work for people if you get very literal minded. If you literally want to know who Kaiser Soze is, I'm sure the ending will work for you, right? If you literally want to know who that is or literally want to do that. But that's what I said. What I would argue with the usual suspects is that it doesn't matter who Kaiser Soze is in the end, because I believe Kaiser Soze is an invention. He's as much a lie as everything else. That's what I felt when I watched the film the first time, and is what I feel now. That's why to me, who Kaiser Soze is isn't that important, because the whole film is one big lie. The whole film is one big deception, because that's the stock and trade of criminals. They have to lie, or at least a number of them do. Otherwise, they're not going to be effective at their jobs. They're not going to be effective at getting what they want. They have to get you to believe what they think you believe, or what works for you. And if it doesn't work for you, they're in trouble. So somebody like Agent Kuyan, who thinks he's the smartest guy in the room, and he's got all the angles, and he knows how to deal with somebody like Verbal Kint, he didn't. That's why the ending of The Usual Suspects is so very good. But it also tells us that this character is smart, the Agent Kuyan character, because he did figure it out in the end, right? I mean, if we look at the end, people will go and look at it and go. Some people will look at the very ending of The Usual Suspects and go, "Well, how could he put all that together?" But if we know that Agent Kuyan is a seasoned federal agent, that he's dealt with criminals before, that he's dealt with all types of nefarious characters, then it's not a stretch that he could have figured it out, right? But the way it's presented, of course, is somewhat filmic, right? It has to be filmic, right? Because we, the audience, have to be able to get how Agent Kuyan was conned. Because we're conned as well. At least the audience is conned, right? For me, when I saw it, it was kind of I got a weird feeling at the end, because it was my suspicions about Verbal Kint were validated, but they weren't validated the way that I thought that was going to be validated. But what the ending of The Usual Suspect does, it is allows us to see the facade being torn down, the false edifice being destroyed. And it does it in that sort of quick way, right? It doesn't waste a lot of time. There's a lean economy at times with this film, especially the very ending. We see him drinking coffee, and he sees where the billboard, the board was created, Skokie, Illinois, and he sees that Bigfoot is on a list of aliases. And he sees an overweight woman. And he sees an ad for Guatemala. And then when he drops his cup of coffee, we see who made the coffee. The broken shard of that cup. Kobayashi. We are given all of the names and details and points of interest that Verbal Kint told Agent Coulion. And we know that this is a lie. And if we don't know it's, and for people who don't know it's a lie, the next images, as I mentioned, of Verbal Kint going out and kind of reverting to normal, this sort of supposedly disabled man, who we find out wasn't disabled after all, and heads into a car and drives off. That's a nice thing about that film. Again, the viewer is conned. But what's important is the essence of the lie. What we have been not only introduced to, but what we have seen is a lie of crime. A lie of crime. Because we know that Verbal has lied. He's deceived. He's constructed this false narrative from bits and pieces around him in that room. That's why I say that con men are like actors, right? Con men are actors, right? And in this case, what Verbal Kint has done is improvise. He's like one of those people, in that sense, he's not a comedy improv guy, but he's basically improvised on the spot. Taking all of those details, all of what he sees around him, and weaving it into this somewhat entertaining narrative, right? And so the essence of The Usual Suspects, as I mentioned before, is that the film is essentially an enormous lie, an immense deception. Hi, Gigi, on the chat. And it is one long con game. It's also, right, Vanna says, it's the subtle evidence that plays the most monumental role. Right. That's why I mentioned that line. See, the line about the greatest trick is an important one because that film is a con game. It's a magic trick, right? But it's also one gigantic lie or series of lies. I like to see it as one gigantic lie or an immense deception, right? You could say it's a series of lies, which would be true, but I would say it is an immense deception. So it's all of those factors. It's this con game that's been played out for us, where we are conned where the viewer and the film goer is conned at the end, much like Dave Coulion was conned, right? He was fooled. See, he thought he could manipulate Verbal, but what he found out was that he got manipulated. He got tricked. He became the person who was like trying to figure out what was happening. See, he thought he knew how the trick was done in a sense, but he didn't know. So this film is in my view, well-constructed film in terms of its script, because it understands that it's as a sort of poker game. It's got to be able to hold its cards. It's got to be able to bluff, and the film basically bluffs its way. Right? As I mentioned, the old cliche statement. If you don't know who the sucker is in a card game, it's probably you. And by the end of this movie, guess who the sucker is? You. And this is why it's such a marvelous film. That's why it's such a, to my mind, great thriller, great film. That I not only enjoyed viewing years ago, but have enjoyed viewing again and again at times. But um, yes, I think so. This was very early on in Bryan Singer's career, and Christopher McQuarrie um, as the screenwriter for this. I don't think he's done quite another film quite like The Usual Suspects, which is interesting. Sometimes you only have one great script, one great story in you as a scriptwriter, no matter how good you are, or as a writer in general. And after you've done it, you never can find that other. Um, so before we wrap up here, for those who have seen the film, there anybody who's seen the movie, anybody who's looked at the film, wants to weigh in, got anything to add or anything like that, now's the time. If not, it's going to be time for me to go. So this is to people in the clouds, um, people in the chat, whoever's in the chat. It's up to you. Well, it's just a test live. This is the last test live. This is for someone. It's the last test live. So I'm not doing any more lives after this. I don't think. So this is it. Um, but what a way to end. What a way to go. Just for those who haven't known, this is of course the live show, and I'm your host. And I hadn't been on YouTube before. I'm a former freelance writer and freelance journalist, print journalist, and I hadn't been on YouTube before in terms of doing lives or doing content or anything like that. And found out I could go live, and so I've done basically test lives. Um, yeah, I don't do reviews anymore. Yeah, I've gotten that. I've gotten that once or twice in my life, or maybe once. Like in the movie. Oh, okay. I wasn't going for that. I just grabbed what I had. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I look like a writer in the movies, right? Writers in the movies always they're stereotypes and archetypes like anything else, right? I don't have any patches on the elbows here, so sorry. Vest sweater or something like that. Yeah. Um, somebody once said somebody said that I had a writer's name, which was interesting. Um, yeah, I don't review. I stopped reviewing films back in 2010, so I don't review films. I am a film analyst, so I have been, and I will go on, um, say, film. I would go on podcasts and radio shows and talk shows and discuss film. The last one I did, I taped an episode of, I think it's called Close Watch, where I analyzed the movie Airplane. If you want to catch any of my film analysis work, I would advise you to go on YouTube. Look me up on YouTube. I analyzed Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut back in 2019 on Crooked Table, which is a podcast about movies. And last year I analyzed a David Lynch's film Mulholland Drive. So I've done that. I also was on a show called Popcorn Politics, where I analyzed the romantic comedy Broadcast News, I think last year. So yeah, I've done a I hope to do more film analysis. So I stopped reviewing in 2010. I don't review movies anymore. So yeah, I don't review movies anymore. So I just do film analysis, and what that means is I'll go on a podcast or a talk show, radio show, whatever. I usually do a movie that's been out 10 years. So that's my I have a certain standard or requirement, which is I can only do movies that have been out 10 years at least to give it time for critical examination and reflection and so forth. And I do that deliberately. So just so that if you're if you heard this and you like film analysis or film dissection and you want to hear what other film dissection I've done, go to Crooked. Look me up. I did 2 episodes of Crooked Table Media. Um, I did an analysis of Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut in 2019, and I did an analysis of David Lynch's Mulholland Drive in 2021. And I have one coming up on I think a show called Close Watch. I don't know when it's coming out, but of Jerry and David Zucker and Jim Abraham's Airplane from 1980. So, but this has been an analysis of the usual suspects entitled The Lie of Crime. So for those of you who have tuned in, who liked it, didn't like it, didn't care about it one way or the other, thanks. This is the last test live, so I'm not scheduled to do lives ever again at this point. So this is the last test live. These lives were interesting. It was interesting going live. Really wasn't a lot of people watching. Well, because it's a test live, I have no interest in producing content or making videos or anything like that. So this is it. I've done what I slated to do, which was the concept of the live show is literature, film, and TV. And I did literature. The first thing I did was the Shakespeare myth, which is the first thing live I did. Second was yesterday with the analysis of the TV show The Prisoner. And the third is today with, let me see, with this analysis of the movie The Usual Suspects. So that'll be it for me. It's my last test live. I did enjoy doing these lives. I think there were a lot of. I think the first one was a lot of fun. Second one was very enjoyable. This one was also nice. It was a very nice live. But that's it for me. I think I don't really have. Yeah, I mean, but someone was asking in the chat. You didn't know, like, this is right. I just started doing this. I mean, I did it because I had to do these test lives to test out going live. So now that I've done what I, you know, allowed myself to do in terms of requirements, it's over. So, it was fun doing lives here on. Well, not fun, but it was a little enjoyable doing lives here on YouTube. But that's it for me. I don't have anything else planned. I don't have any other lives planned. That's been it. I think these test lives are interesting. Something I can look at and examine. But for those who did watch it, and for those who were in the chat, there weren't really too many people who watched or in the chat. Thank you. Um, at this point, it's time for me to move on. And as they said in The Usual Suspects, and with that,